Welcome and thank you for joining us for the Employment First and Retain Kentucky Employer Seminar Series today. My name is Kimberly Wickert and I am with Retain Kentucky at the University of Kentucky's Human Development Institute. I'm a Generation X white female with blonde hair and glasses, and today I'm wearing a cream-colored sweater with a blue Retain virtual background. We do have captioning available to you, but if you do not wish to use this feature, you can turn it off. We will also be taking questions during the presentation today, so please put those in the chat and we will be monitoring that throughout the presentation. We'll also have this recording and all of our previous Retain Kentucky and Employment First recordings at our Retain Kentucky media site, and I will put that link in the chat as well. If you ever want to go back and watch this one or others, we welcome and encourage you to do so. We will also be sending out certificates of attendance to all attendees today within about a week, so you can have that. And we would ask that you please take a few minutes to complete the survey that will be sent to you following today's webinar to provide feedback for our future webinars. We really appreciate your input and let us know what you would like to hear about in the future. So with that, I'm going to ask Kelly to go ahead and move to the next slide and just let you know that the information that is contained in today's presentation is intended for informational purposes and may not reflect the views or opinions of the Employment First Council, the University of Kentucky Human Development Institute, or its individual employees. And although we attempt to provide accessible, accurate, and current information, no guarantees are made to that effect. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. And I'm really excited to share with you our Employment First and Retain Kentucky February Employer Seminar Series, and that is resources employers can use to promote stay at and return to work. And that's going to be February 18th from noon to 12:45 Eastern Time. I'll also put that link in the chat. And we're going to have Retain's own Elizabeth Thompson join me, and we're going to talk about free resources that are available in Kentucky and also nationally, and how you can access those resources, and talk about how Retain Kentucky helps promote stay at work for workers. So join us if you can, and if you can't, we'll also have that uploaded to our Retain Kentucky media site. And then lastly, I'm excited to let you know that the Kentucky Chamber Foundation's Disability Hiring Academy, sponsored by the University of Kentucky Human Development Institute, offers a comprehensive training program designed to equip human resource professionals, business leaders with skills to recruit, train, and retain talent from the disabled community, strengthening their organizations and enhancing workplace diversity. This also will offer SHRM professional development credits, and it's going to be held on January 28th, 29th, and February 5th at the Chamber offices in Frankfort, Kentucky, and I'll put the link in here as well. I'm excited to be part of this planning an advisory council, and I can tell you that it's 3 days chock full of outstanding content and really some hands-on experience that our attendees are going to be able to get from this. So please join us if you can. Okay, so those are the housekeeping items. I'm just going to take another minute and ask you to join me in welcoming Kelly Burke, our subject matter expert today. I had the opportunity to meet Kelly last August, where she was part of the Kentucky SHRM conference in Louisville, and she was with our partners at the Kentucky Chamber, and they were doing a presentation on the Military Hiring Academy. And it was at this point I knew Kelly and I needed to collaborate, and one of the things was the Employer Seminar Series. And since then, we've also been able to help support the kickoff of the Northern Kentucky Coalition for Workforce Diversity. And Kelly, along with me, will also be a presenter at the Disability Hiring Academy at the end of this month. So Kelly, after we met last year and I connected on LinkedIn and I saw your focus and expertise in trauma-informed leadership, I knew you would be a great speaker for our Employer Seminar Series. And we are so appreciative that you're willing to share your expertise on this topic today. So I'm going to let you take it from here and share more about yourself and trauma-informed leadership. So thank you, Kelly.
Awesome. Awesome. Gosh, like way to make a gal blush, right? All of these things you're talking about. So as Kimberly talked about too, we will be presenting as part of that Disability Hiring Academy. What I will be focusing on with that is building inclusive teams. So you're going to hear a lot about psychological safety and inclusivity and all of these things, because they are also part of trauma-informed leadership as well. And it all kind of goes together. So you're going to hear that. And one thing I will say too, I'm going to give myself a disclaimer today in that, he wasn't a Christmas puppy, but we did get him a couple weeks ago. And he does not like to stay quiet because he's a puppy. He's a 9-week-old puppy. So you might hear him and the other dogs in the background. And that is all part of the glory and wonderfulness of being able to work from home. So hopefully you like dogs, because you're probably going to hear them. But little bit about me. So I am a master's prepared social worker. I'm currently seeking my doctorate in social work from the University of Louisville's Kent School of Social Work. So shout out to them. I think we might have some folks on the line representing that as well. I am a certified HR professional with I'm an APHR, have a handful of different licenses, business experience with my MBA, and being at Humana for the past almost 11 years. But really my passion, my focus is on trauma-informed leadership and really being a key contributor to our psychological safety here within the corporate space. So came into learning about trauma-informed care as a clinician. So I started out as a baby social worker within the Department of Children. So here in the state of Kentucky, in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and really learned through that and within my experience within the hospital about trauma-informed care. Also kicked around the idea of teaching like middle school, high school for a little while. So that's a lot of where trauma-informed leadership kind of got its start. So all of these things, found out about it. And then really I was like, you know what, like we need this in the corporate space. Like this is how we are going to transition into really being leaders in the area and in the business that we are. And the more research that I did, the more I found out, I was like, yep, I was right. Like we need this. This is how we're going to do this. So I'm excited to bring this to you today. This is taking some information from a larger training, an actual CEU for nurses and social workers training that I do. Kind of took all of the high level overview of all of that and put this into the 45 minutes or less that we have together today. So it is going to be high level, kind of a crash course, but it's going to give you some of the initial information and research that you need to get a good idea of maybe how to take some of this back to your teams and your where you're at. So today we are going to discuss and define what trauma is. We are going to describe trauma-informed leadership, outline some trauma-informed leadership responses, and then recognize how trauma-informed leadership can impact the mental health and well-being of individuals. So your associates, your team members, whatever it might be or look like for you, but how that impacts the health and well-being. So I see Dr. Rima. Hello and welcome. Posted that link in there for the DSW. I'm so happy that you're joining today. All right, so I want to begin our discussion with some shared agreements. And you may or may not have seen these before, but I always start all of my presentations, all of my facilitation with some shared agreements. And this is really so that we can all ensure that we have an equitable experience in our conversation today. And I want you to pay attention to some of the language that's being used here. So we're talking about shared agreements. These are things that we are all sharing an agreement to do, right? Like I'm not telling you, you have to do these things, that these are the ground rules, or that if you break these rules, you're in trouble. These are just things that I want us to be able to engage together with. And these are things that I have found have helped individuals have an equitable experience a good experience in facilitation and as part of these discussions. So just curious if you want to pop it into chat. One, if there's anything that doesn't make sense or that you would like some additional explanation on, or anything that kind of makes you go like, oh, I didn't think about that before, or that's a good idea. And then third, anything that you would want to add that would help you have an equitable experience. And regarding the information on U of L, we can send that out as part of the notes too, because I see there's a question you can't copy and paste. Or if that was Kimberly, but sorry. So take and make space. Angela, that is my favorite. So I always ask if anybody, like if after folks start coming to things more often, I will ask like, hey, remind me what your favorite is. That is my favorite. I absolutely love take space and make space because there is more than enough space here for all of us. And we need to do our due diligence to make sure that we are making space for everyone, that we're inviting folks in, that we're making sure that you know, we are giving that space to others. We're hearing all of those voices that are here today. Yeah, I love that. Step up and step back. Some others that might be hard are reduce the multitasking, right? That is something that we do all the time, and it just kind of became kind of the culture. And we really do want to make sure that we are showing up and we're being here. Accept and expect non-closure. So that is a good one too, Monique, because we are humans. Our brains keep working even after this 45 minutes together. And so we're not going to be able to put all this in a nice, pretty bow and send it off in a package with you. And that's okay. I'm also here. I'm always open to further discussion, ongoing chats about it. So for sure. I love that. Yes. And have fun. Have fun and be here. Allow yourself to show up as the imperfect human beings that you are. So I appreciate you all sharing that. All right, so today we're going to discuss what trauma is, how it can show up at work, and steps that you can take to reduce its impact and help make your place a trauma-informed workplace. So when I say the word trauma, what comes to mind? So pop that in chat, just the first thing. It might be your own experience, might be something you know, but what's the first thing that comes to mind when I use the word trauma? I love it. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm going through and reading these. Damage, stressful, bad things, PTSD, all barking in the background while you're trying to present to, you know, 150 people. Yes, things that stick with you, car accident, all of these things. Yes, good job. And if you haven't already noticed, I am a participatory presenter, so I'm going to ask you all to engage, and I appreciate you you participating back, you engaging. All right, so y'all are absolutely correct, and I appreciate you all sharing your thoughts on the term trauma. So we're now going to talk about maybe an official definition. The interesting thing is there is no official definition, right? There's lots of information regarding the concept of trauma, you know, countless academic and medical journals, research papers, but many times what we see as part of those narratives is the author's own definition of trauma. And each one is a little different or utilizes kind of a slightly different set of criteria. So for our discussion today, we'll utilize the idea that trauma is an event that is deeply distressing or disturbing. So deeply distressing or a disturbing experience. And something to keep in mind with this definition is that it doesn't put specifics around what those events have to be. Like, we're not saying it has to be an act of war, or you must have thought you were going to die or something like that. It's simply that you perceive the event as distressing. And that could be physical, sexual, emotional abuse, childhood neglect, living with a family member with mental health or substance abuse, sudden or unexplained separation from a loved one, poverty, racism, discrimination, oppression, all of these things can and have been shown to be traumatic experiences. And of course, there is the obvious violence in the community, war, terrorism, those are traumatic events. But the biggest thing is that it just has to be something that you perceived as distressing. So many things that might be traumatic to some may not be traumatic to others, and vice versa. Therefore, a more complete definition that we could use is, and this is going to be a long one, so individual trauma that results from an event, series of events, or circumstances that is experienced by an individual is physically and emotionally harmful or life-threatening and has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. That was a long one, right? So let me break that down. Biggest things to take away from that is the lasting adverse effects. So typically we wouldn't think of stress at work, like one stressful instance as being traumatic. That's a whole other conversation, right? About vicarious trauma, burnout, ongoing things there. But just one, like had a stressful day at work, that's not what we would necessarily call traumatic. But if it's ongoing and it has that adverse effect on their well-being, then that would be considered traumatic. And those things can get to that point. So keep that in mind as we talk about this today too. What questions or feedback do you have concerning trauma and its definition? Okay. So whenever I speak about traumatic events, I would be remiss if I didn't touch on the CDC Kaiser Permanente Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACE study. Many of you are probably familiar with that term, ACEs or ACE study. It's one of the largest investigations of childhood abuse and neglect, health challenges, and later life health and well-being. And so what it did is it showed, and I could literally do like a whole presentation about just the ACE study, but some populations are more vulnerable to experiencing ACEs because of the social and economic conditions in which they live, learn, work, and play. And that's very important to keep in mind when we think about interacting with peers and colleagues or the individuals like our clients, our members, those that we serve. And the intersectionality of all of these trauma players and the subsequent dealing or not dealing with them in an appropriate manner is really what shapes us to be the adults that we are today. And the ACE score is the total sum of the different categories. It's broken into a couple different categories of ACEs reported by the individual filling out the survey. And the study the study findings show a graded dose response relationship between ACEs and the negative health and well-being outcomes. So in other words, as the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk for negative outcomes. Now, the reason why I said risk and not just is because there are other things, there are mitigating ways, glimmers, different things that can happen. And then everybody obviously develops differently. So it is still just a risk, but as the ACEs increase, so does the risk for those negative outcomes. What questions do you have about ACEs?
Kelly, we have a question from Dr. Tidwell, and he asked if trauma can be reversed such that it is no longer lasting.
So that is a really great question. And that is kind of what I referred to with the risk. So it's in the presentation, and now they're all going to bark. See, like, it's a great example of experiences. So what you can have happen for somebody is if they are willing to do the work, the trauma work around that, you can reduce the negative outcomes, but ultimately it's more of a acceptance and commitment type of thing where that is always there. It's always there for them, but individuals can work to reduce the level or the impact that might have. So it doesn't ever go away, but we can work to reduce its impact. Does that help?
Thank you.
I see Alicia's question. It can. again, like it's correlated to that risk, and it really just depends on the individual. And that's why too, like when we talk about this, that's why having a general trauma informed approach, you don't have to know, and we'll get to, I'm actually getting ahead of myself, but you don't have to know the level or even what actually happened, but just approaching it in a trauma informed manner can help reduce some of those negative impacts, the severity, the duration. Thanks, Jonathan. Exactly. So if you're familiar with acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, that's a really good one, because it talks about like uses the bus as an analogy, and you're going to put it on the back of the bus while you're driving. It's not sitting up front with you. It's, again, that could be a whole presentation of treatment on its own. But yeah. Kimberly, they're hungry for that deep information.
They are. This is great.
Right. So let's talk about what trauma-informed leadership actually is and how we can see it show up in our teams. All right. So trauma-informed leadership is a form of transformational leadership. And by recognizing and addressing the emotional well-being of your team, you can create a resilient and engaged workforce. So this leadership style fosters trust, it reduces turnover, and it enhances productivity, all of which are vital for business success, right? So trauma-informed leadership is an approach to management that recognizes and responds. So those two things are important: recognizes and responds. You can't have the data and not do anything with it. So recognizes and responds to the impact of trauma on an individual within the workplace. And it involves understanding that past or current trauma can impact an employee's behavior, their performance, and their well-being. Again, it can. Some folks are dealing with it a little different. It shows up different for everybody, but it's just that understanding that it can impact an employee's behavior, their performance, and their well-being. And so what I want to make very clear, and I've already said this, is being trauma-informed leaders, it is very important for us to keep in mind that I am in no way expecting folks to be therapists or looking for you to actually do any type of intervention or anything like that, unless that's what your role actually does, right? That is not what trauma-informed leadership is talking about. It is literally recognizing and responding to the potential that this exists for everybody. You don't need to ask the specifics. You can, if that is your relationship with that individual. You don't need to have their life story. Again, you can if that's that relationship. It's just knowing that this can and does exist for a lot of people. And we'll talk about it. Honestly, it exists for everybody, but we'll talk about that in a second too. You don't have to have that information in order to be trauma informed. You simply have to operate from the standpoint that everyone has experiences, and some of those experiences are traumatic, and knowing that we all have something we find deeply disturbing or distressing. So we talked about adverse childhood events. I want to turn our attention to traumatic events that we may have experienced as adults. Can anybody think of any events that might have happened in the past 4 or 5 years that could be construed as traumatic? Yeah, absolutely. So I'm seeing some COVID, 9/11, absolutely. Weather. Yeah. So pandemic is really the biggest one. Trump election, any political turmoil, right? All of these things. You're absolutely right. So we know that the pandemic, that's typically the one that I use as an example, because we can all very easily connect to that, right? And it was connected within the research to PTSD. We know that it was connected to an increase in depression and anxiety. Then add in the continued concerns surrounding social and civil unrest, war, hate crimes, political turmoil. Now we have, the wildfires. The list just keeps going on, right? It's like this constant barrage of different things that we're managing. And so when we see these things show up in the workplace as things like hypervigilance, that sense of hopelessness, rigidness, I think is a lot of times something that we see, agitation, avoidance, all of these things. This is how it shows up in individuals, especially when they're trying to mask it and they're trying not to show it. You'll see it kind of show up in different ways. So another key thing to keep in mind from the standpoint of traumatic events is how our own dimensions of diversity can play a part in making us susceptible to trauma, or have more, unfortunately, opportunities to be hit with traumatic events. So when I first designed this larger presentation in 2020, we talked a lot about the events that were top of mind at the time, which we just touched on. None of those things at that time were necessarily new, right? Like those communities had been dealing with those things, unfortunately, for a while. It just kind of showed up in the moment and forced everyone to be aware of them as part of like this collective trauma that we were all experiencing, whether we knew or desired to call it that at the moment. But as we continue to move 4 years and beyond, there's kind of a little bit more clarity around what it was that was really going on that was the catalyst for some of those experiences. That is, those various dimensions of diversity and how they have the ability to greatly impact how we show up and experience the world. So what you see here is what's called the Table of Diversity, and it was created by Demetria Miles McDonough, who's the CEO of Decide Diversity. And if I'm not mistaken, she is a Louisville native. So local gal on top of all of it. So she wanted to make a visual that would help depict the various dimensions of diversity to make it easier for folks to kind of wrap their brain around it. Like what makes us us? And so each column represents a different category or dimension of diversity. And so you can look at each one and kind of find where you are in that column, right? And so you're going to find yourself in pretty much each column in a different area. And so as you start looking at each one, keep in mind that those that don't resemble what she refers to as the mythical human, or those that are in bold. So like that first column, white's in bold, second column is male. So it goes through. The bolded ones are what she refers to as the mythical human. And the less that you have as the mythical human, the greater likelihood of traumatic events or ACEs due to those dimensions of diversity and things like racial trauma, generational trauma, whatever it might be. But the mythical human, which doesn't actually exist, right? Like it isn't this better person, but it's the what we see as being the dominant culture. And so the less that you have of the mythical human, the more likelihood of traumatic events. So as you think about your own workforce or those that you're leading, those that you're serving, I'm hoping that you can see how some of these various dimensions can really impact the way that they show up to work or in situations or whatever it might be. Yeah, and Jonathan, Decide Diversity is Demetria's website. I'm pretty sure she has it on there. But this will also be in the in the materials. And she, by the way, she keeps this updated because one of the things is too, these will shift and change as the makeup of the US kind of shifts and changes too. Thinking the easiest one to think about is generationally. The youngest generation in the workforce is going to be part of the mythical human. So as we continue to get older and that younger generation becomes a different one, then that will become part of that mythical human. But so can other things shift and change as well. And she does update it pretty regularly, or at least make sure that is the most accurate, most up to date. All right, but let's dig a little bit deeper into that thought, operating from the understanding of what trauma-informed leadership is. So work engagement is most often defined as a positive and active psychological state that is characterized by vigor, dedication, and absorption. We know, and if you're a leader of others, you see it, engaged employees are full of energy. In addition, they have a very positive attitude towards their work. Even if the work is hard and taxing, they still have that positive attitude towards it. They're enthusiastic about what they're doing. And engaged employees often forget about the time. Like they get fully immersed in their work. And I was telling Kimberly before we started, like I will get rolling on this presentation and I will just go. Like I get engaged in it. And so you might have to slow me down or make me stop for questions or whatever. So engaged employees will often forget about the time because they're fully immersed in their work activities. And those dealing with trauma ineffectively, or those who may have adopted certain behaviors that they feel like are dealing with trauma effectively, are going to present at work oftentimes in the opposite manner. And many times people don't even realize that they've adopted certain behaviors as a way of dealing with trauma. There are a lot of times the people that we might say like, oh, you know them, they've just always been that way, or you can't really take anything they say personally, they don't mean it. The trauma response in the workplace has become so ingrained that peers see it as part of their personality. And another key aspect to keep in mind is a part that the leader plays. If someone has spent their entire life reacting to certain triggers a specific way, we may not even know that we're the one that's creating the trauma response in them. So without prior trauma work, the individual isn't going to be able to articulate what's happening, and may not even recognize that something is happening, right? That they're having a response to that. They may not know that. And it just plays out like it always has, right? And that isn't necessarily healthy or productive. And from a business perspective, it does have a detrimental impact on overall performance and bottom line. And a really quick example of that is I had a individual that I was leading, and I would schedule one-on-ones with her, like regular weekly one-on-ones. Like this is just something I do with all of my associates, right? Scheduled them for Thursdays. And she would very often miss our meetings, would say she forgot, whatever. Like it just felt like it got to the point where I was like, is this gal, like, is she purposely avoiding our one-on-ones? Like, what's going on here? And so when I had a conversation with her, we eventually got to the conversation where she told me that when she was little, her dad would get her from her mom on Thursdays, and she would know every single time that it was going to be a negative experience between her and her father when he came to pick her up. And so in her head, she had associated Thursdays with just any interaction on Thursdays as being a negative one. I didn't know that, right? Like, unless she had told me that, I never would have changed it. We were able to get to that point as part of our relationship, build that psychological safety, be able to get to that point. But once she told me and I was able to move it, I mean, I just moved it to Wednesdays and never late, never missed it, had really great productive conversations. But had I not stopped and thought, like, what leaned into that curiosity and had that conversation with her, I might not have known that and would have just seen that as avoidance or her not doing her job or whatever that might be. So that's a really kind of random example, but it's one that I think about all the time when I think about how some folks might show up and not realize or have something related to a traumatic experience that's now impacting the way that they show up in the workplace. So discussion time real quick. We've thought about what happened over the past couple of years. We've talked about how just being who we are can potentially contribute to negative experiences. And so I'm curious to hear from you all. How might you have seen some of these things that we've talked about play out in your current workplace, prior employers, anything coming to mind? Like, as I'm talking about this, like anything like pew, pew, popping off in your brain that you think might be relevant to share? So I got to open the chat. So Julian, oh my gosh, yes, coming out as trans, that is a huge step for someone. And Kelly, I see people checking out. Lori, compassion fatigue, absolutely. Amanda, quiet quitting, not showing for extra work, events, social, absolutely. Difficulty communicating, James, yes. Anxiety over driving impact work travel for a friend, coworker, conflict avoidance at all costs, yes, absolutely. Shut down, yes, no motivation. Oh my gosh, Melissa, yes. And as a parent of a high schooler, middle schooler, and elementary school child, anxiety for the parents who, see their kids off on the bus every day. So Paige, I work in a residential facility where youth have experienced abuse and neglect. Many of our employees get into this field due to their own personal experiences, but end up experiencing post-secondary trauma when intervening. I'm going to take a moment and touch on that, Paige. So that is actually where, so I kind of talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but that is where I really saw the need for trauma-informed leadership. That's really what triggered it for me, was when I worked at a residential treatment facility for the state as the interim treatment director there, and saw our youth service workers needed trauma-informed everything just as much as those kiddos did, right? Like just as much. And that is really what started this whole journey for me of like, this needs to be brought to the individuals here. Like this can't just stay with our patients. It can't just stay in care management. Like we all need this, because you are absolutely right. Oh yes, Yolanda, fear in leadership can be very toxic. Yep. Well, I appreciate you all sharing that and engaging with me some more. All right, let's talk about the trauma-informed response. So we know that effective teams need the following to be successful. They need predictability, transparency, respect, empathy, and safety. So from a leadership perspective, that is what we know teams need to be successful. Well, guess what? All of those things are also what we need to be trauma informed. So people who have suffered chronic trauma, they seek predictability. And work can be a predictable place, right? But it can also be very unpredictable, especially if you work in a tumultuous business like healthcare delivery, like I do. And if you're in an area of business that's anything like mine, predictability can honestly be very difficult at times. And so that's where transparency comes into play. There are many things, again, especially if you are a leader of leaders, that you can't be transparent about, right? Like we can't discuss this decision just yet. It's not public, whatever it might be. But when you can, you absolutely must be transparent. You must bring folks into that decision making. You must provide that background. You must make that concerted effort to be transparent. Respect is a given, I think, for most people, but ensure that you're making that conscious effort and continued effort to be respectful. And I want you to break the golden rule, okay? Don't treat others as you want to be treated. Treat others as they want to be treated. And if you don't know how they want to be treated, then ask. Lean into that curiosity. And you also want to think about respect from that standpoint. And so you want to really get into, if you make a mistake, own up to it, right? Like keep those promises. And if you legitimately can't, because things change, right? Like not always we say we had full intentions of doing it and then something happened and we can't, own up to it, say, sorry, this is what happened. Had every intention to do it, just didn't work out. Let's figure something else out. And then consistency and accountability, they really do show others that you respect them and their contributions. And empathy is another one that seems obvious to me as a social worker, but often we forget about it in the workplace, especially in a corporate workplace. So it's important for us to understand the difference between empathy and sympathy. Once you have an understanding and knowledge of trauma, especially how trauma affects the minds and bodies of people, I'm hoping that you'll kind of have that paradigm shift to ask kind of like, goodness gracious, what is wrong with this person? To one where maybe you're more asking like, gosh, I wonder what happened to this individual, or wonder if this is something that's, impacting the way they show up. Again, heard me say it a million times now, being curious, really leaning into that curiosity and seeking an understanding and intent behind behavior that may be driven by certain, sometimes unconscious trauma responses is really how we're going to show empathy in the workplace. And lastly, effective teams operating in a trauma-informed manner, they need safety. And by safety, I mean psychological safety. This is the ability to fall forward, empowering associates to be their authentic self and valuing the contribution that comes from this. So this is accomplished on teams by demonstrating engagement, showing understanding, being inclusive, showing confidence and conviction without appearing inflexible, and your team making your team a part of that decision-making process as much as possible. So approaching teams and leadership in a trauma-informed manner means teams can operate more effectively by also ensuring that we're caring for the person that we're interacting with. This creates a more resilient, agile workforce who's able to deliver positive outcomes to our consumers. And it's really a ripple effect. It doesn't stop with the person or the people that we're interacting with at the moment. It really does continue through to other interactions that they have and so on. And I want to really quick just say too, one thing that I often hear with this is, okay, well, if I'm going to be empathetic at work, then how am I going to hold somebody accountable? And hopefully you all have heard of the concept of compassionate accountability. And so there is the ability and should be the ability to be both empathetic and compassionate with also still holding folks accountable, because you can't really have one without the other. Again, I could do a whole presentation about compassionate accountability, but one without the other is coddling, and one without the other is on the other end of that spectrum is really just insincerity. So with both, you care for that individual, you want them to be successful, and you're going to give them what they need, the feedback, the tools, whatever, to be successful. It essentially, you're putting that ball in their court. Like, we've laid this out, let's do it. I'm going to be here to support you, but ultimately, you know the expectations. Let's get in and do it arm in arm together. So if you've not researched or heard of compassionate accountability, I would encourage you to Google that. Nate Rigler is his name. He wrote a book about it. I also think I share things on this on my LinkedIn pretty often, so probably could find some links in there as well, but it is like an official concept theory. So definitely look it up. All right, true or false? Responding with empathy to someone who is struggling with performance metrics can be a form of trauma-informed leadership response. What do you think? All right, I'm seeing both. The question can sometimes come off as you got to think about it correctly, but empathy is always the key, right? Like, empathy is always a way to respond to pretty much any situation. It can diffuse and de-escalate anger. You can increase engagement and buy-in. You can establish psychological safety, which improves productivity. You can simply operate as a good human being with empathy. And I also, again, want to point out, it is you still have KPIs and business metrics, and still treat people with respect and empathy while building psychologically safe teams. And again, Project Aristotle on psych safety talks about how it actually makes the teams more effective. So I have a presentation on leading with empathy, and maybe we can get that on a future agenda, Kimberly. We can talk about that too. But one of those things I could talk about all day as well, and happy to continue that conversation with folks in the future if that would be helpful. I know we're getting on time, so I want to talk really quick about once you realize that almost all of your colleagues have experienced some type of trauma, you will hopefully be able to interact in a different way than you might have in the past. So you'll acknowledge your own trauma, hopefully think about through some of those things, and be able to say things like, what's been the toughest thing for you? Or what does support look like for you right now as you manage these multiple priorities? Such language and action is us recognizing how it impacts others. And when we recognize this, you can respond in an appropriate manner so that folks feel heard and validated, and ultimately resist re-traumatization by interacting in a way that is not congruent with compassion and empathy. And that, friends, is also you self-regulating, which creates a virtuous cycle, which, by the way, reduces rates of burnout and can help improve performance and retention. So the last thing I'll say is, here's some skills, some actionable items that you can take back to your teams, to your business areas, to your organizations, whatever that might be, to actually help you. It connects to those. Each one, routines is to predictability and transparency. Rituals connects to respect. Relationships connects to empathy, and regulation helps create psychological safety and is interconnected with the other 3 R's. So that crash course in trauma-informed leadership, I know you all also sent in some questions. I will go through some questions beforehand. I'll go through those and try to pull some answers too that we can send out just as general information, so that you get those answered as well. But that is it, Kimberly. What other open discussion or time? I'm free until 1 o'clock, but want to respect everybody else's time.
Absolutely. And Gina said we need much more about this topic, maybe a series. So that's a great idea. And a lot of great content that you shared. Thank you so much. And I think you did answer a lot of those questions, but also appreciate you kind of taking a deeper dive and
Yeah.
getting back to people individually if there were some things that you weren't able to cover. But I really appreciate like the examples that you gave, and you and I had talked a little bit about, employers that I've worked with say, we need to meet those key performance indicators, and how can I do that and be a trauma informed leader. And I think you gave some really good examples, and start with empathy. So I appreciate that perspective as well. We've got a lot of people saying thank you, great presentation, asking about secondary trauma amongst leaders.
Mhm. Yeah, I was gonna say I have Kimberly, you and I can talk about. I can send you some of these other decks. You can see if they would be of value, but do have some additional information on vicarious trauma, but also vicarious growth and resilience, because there's the other side of that. So definitely, like I said, passion of mine, love to talk about it. So don't threaten me with a good time, of coming back and talking more about it, because I will take you all up on it. So we can talk about it.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. And we appreciate your time today, Kelly, and everybody else's time. And I hope everybody has a great rest of their day and week. And we will be sending out the slide deck and surveys and certificates in the next few days. So thank you so much, and have a great day.
Awesome. Bye, y'all.
Bye.